Hello, everyone. I'm Siri Vaith, Executive Director of CFRI, the Cystic Fibrosis Research Institute, and I welcome you to what promises to be an extremely interesting podcast with Dr. David Weill. Before we get started, as always, please note that the information and insights shared in this recording should not be used for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and of course, to consult with your physician before making any changes to your healthcare. We thank our sponsors whose support has made this webinar possible: Vertex Pharmaceuticals, Gilead Sciences, and Viatris. So we have the business out of the way, we can dive in. I'm here with Dr. David Weill, who spent over 20 years as a transplant physician, 10 of which were spent directing Stanford Center for Advanced Lung Disease and the Lung Transplant Program. He left Stanford in 2016 to return to his native New Orleans, where he founded Weill Consulting Group, which is focused on improving the delivery of transplant care. In 2021, he released his first book, Exhale: Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant, which is an incredibly personal memoir of his years in transplant, which I highly recommend to everybody, and which we did talk about in a podcast soon after the book's release. Now, Dr. Weill has released his second book and his first fictional novel, All That Really Matters, in which transplant plays a central theme. We're honored to have Dr. Weill here to talk about his journey, share a reading from his book, hopefully, and answer some questions. Welcome, Dr. Weill.
Siri, so glad to be with you again.
It's deja vu all over again, almost.
That's right.
So the last time we spoke, it was to promote your book, Exhale, which was nonfiction. And now we're here to discuss your newly released fictional novel. So starting with the obvious, what led you to move from nonfiction to fiction? Was this always your first love? And also, which medium do you prefer?
I never really conceived of writing a novel. I thought that I would actually stick along the nonfiction path. In fact, I have a third book that's already under contract that's back to nonfiction again. And that book was actually supposed to go before this book. But I really enjoyed writing this novel because I thought, even though I explored some themes with regard to healthcare and transplantation and the ethics surrounding what we do, I didn't think that I went quite far enough into it. And fiction allowed me the latitude to move around a little bit without having to be 100% accurate and truthful and stick to a particular thing that happened to me. But with this story, I could actually get into a lot of the same themes, but to actually dig deeper because of the fictional nature of it. I wasn't going to offend anybody, I don't think, nor was I going to expose real patients to possible identity. So I really enjoyed the process very much.
So accurate and truthful, yes, just not personal to you.
Exactly. Everything that happened in this book was not made up out of thin air. In other words, it's a lot of things that I saw in the hospital, some of which happened to me, some of which happened to other people. But all of it, I think, is an accurate depiction of what really happens in a transplant setting. So I think you're right, and thanks for the clarification, because it really is. It's a made-up story, but it's not made up, if that makes sense. Somebody once said that fiction is a pack of lies that tells the truth, and so here it is.
I like that description. So having said that, why don't you tell us a bit about the book's plot?
So the book is based on a protagonist, Dr. Joe Bosco, who's a hard-charging heart and lung transplant surgeon who has a steep rise in his career and a steep decline. He actually has very high expectations put on him by himself and by his Nobel Prize winning laureate father, who wanted great things from him. And Joe sometimes could live up to that, and sometimes he couldn't. There's a love interest in the story. Joe actually meets somebody very early in his career who he falls in love with. And like so many people in our field, the relationships we all have are impacted by what we do. And that's the same for Joe.
So you've described transplant in the past as a team sport. And of course, anybody who writes will say it is a very solitary endeavor. And so I'm just curious what led from really very dramatic shift of, I mean, it's not just obviously medical practice and writing, but just the sense of being surrounded by a team versus something that's very much in your own head, your own creativity and, mental process.
Yeah, you're spot on, Siri. I mean, this is a totally different muscle that I'm exercising here. I mean, when I was at Stanford, for instance, our team had 55 people on the transplant team. I saw most of them every day, 24/7, 365. There was a lot of people around. 17,000 people worked at Stanford, so it was like going into a little city every day. Writing is entirely different. Until actually the book comes out, and I'm talking to folks like you and others, it's pretty much myself, occasional conversations with the editor, occasional conversations with my agent, but not much. It's really just me and the page, and I think that would have been a problem for me earlier in my life when I needed a little more action and a little more people around me. But I guess I've gotten to the stage where I take comfort really in the blank page in front of me.
Were there any, I mean, your previous book was all about patients that you had treated, worked with, masked, hopefully to shield their identities. This time, with it being fictional, are there any real life people, patients that are incorporated into this novel, but it's fictional, therefore even more masked?
Yeah, there are. I think that I draw a lot from my experience in this novel from what I saw in the hospital, not only the patients, but also the people that I worked with. So the characters in the book really are not so much one person that could be identified in real life. It's more combinations of people, I think. But they're really not made up out of thin air. This isn't science fiction. This is actually these are circumstances that happen in hospitals every day. And so while some of the stories I suppose could be considered, well, that doesn't really happen. It actually does. I mean, all of what I wrote in the book is real life in that way. So it very much silhouettes a busy transplant hospital and all the patient issues for sure, but also the interpersonal relationships among the team, which I've always been interested in.
So, in the novel, it describes unethical hospital practices and that are going to determine a patient's placement on the transplant list, really the decisions between life and death for many people. And it addresses in its way the need for more transparency in the allocation system. So I'd love it if you would talk more about that.
Yeah, transplant is I've always considered the tip of the spear of medicine. So the problems that exist in medicine are just amplified in transplant because of its intensity, because of the very direct life and death situations that you're dealing with. And also, there's a lot of scrutiny of transplant programs. It's been said, and I believe this, especially now that I'm a consultant in the transplant arena, and I work with a variety of hospitals across the country. It's the most regulated area of medicine. And so when the stakes go up, and I think this is true in any endeavor, when the stakes go up, you can either behave morally and ethically or not. And what we see in the novel is some instances where the right thing was done and some instances where the right thing was not done. And I think that from my experience, both in programs that I worked in and also in programs that I consult with, I've seen both. I've seen really courageous and brilliant minds going to work every day doing the right thing for their patients, and I've seen the opposite as well.
And so you're doing this consulting work. Can you tell us more about what that entails when you're working with other hospitals? What are they needing to improve their systems?
Yeah, yeah, it's usually that the programs are underperforming either from an outcomes issues, the patients aren't doing as well as they should, or from a volume issue. In other words, they're not doing enough transplants. And I think the two go together. Quality usually runs with programs that are doing more transplant operations. that's one bucket that I work on. I also work on programs or with hospitals that want to start a new transplant program, whether it's heart, lung, kidney, or liver. I kind of come in and my team comes in and we help them set that up. I've got international clients as well that want to do something different and they want to do something that may have been something that we in the United States were doing in the 1980s and 1990s, and they're just doing it right now. And so I help them get those programs in order as well. So most of what I'm doing is really directed toward making the programs better, so hopefully the patients will do better.
Well, it's so interesting because in the CF world, I mean, people always say, choose the transplant center that does lots of transplants. You know, outcomes are always better. But that's sort of a hard setup, right, for anybody who doesn't do a lot because they're never going to do more.
Right, right.
People are always going, so it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. But
It is, and I've thought a lot about that issue and written a lot about it, about very small transplant programs that aren't very good year after year, and whether or not they should continue to exist. I think it's a real question. It goes well beyond just a medical opinion. It's really a political, economic, and kind of a societal decision about how many of these programs should we have.
so I know last year, there was a lot of topic about problems with the allocation system, and there was a whole new policy, I believe, the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network having a new policy that was supposed to improve equity and address disparities. Love to hear more about that and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's high time. I've been cheering on the evolution of the organ allocation system. I think since I got out of training, so I've been at this since the early '90s. We desperately needed to change how we allocate organs in our country. I think that there's inefficiencies all the way through. I think there's inequities all the way through. I think that that results in people waiting either longer on the waiting list than they should or actually passing away on the waiting list. I think our system has hurt patients. It has not performed as it should. And I've been very encouraged in the last, say, handful of years about the innovations that are occurring in the organ allocation system, such that we can keep organs alive longer. We can actually do daytime surgeries much more readily as a result. There's actually a company in full disclosure that I serve on the board of, Transmedics, who have set up a procurement system where the transplant centers are able to stay at home and not have to fly out and get the organs. The organs actually come to you. These are all big changes in the life of a transplant program. And I think that they go along well with the fact that we need more physicians and surgeons who are doing this kind of work. And I think if we make the job more doable, we'll attract more people to the field.
So, at what point do we have the honor of you sharing a reading with us?
Well, I'll do it right now. Um, I, uh, I really want to read the beginning of the book because I think, like most beginnings, at least as an author, you want to set up the story, and I think that this sets up the story pretty well. So this book is in first person. It's in the voice of my protagonist, Dr. Joe Bosco, my heart and lung transplant surgeon. Um, any any notion that this guy is me is not it. I want to dispel that right away because I'm
You
sure
know,
that's
everybody's thinking that.
I know they are, but I'm a much better guy than this guy is. At least I think so. So anyway, um, so here it is. This is just the opening of the book. I creased the blank page, flattening the journal spine one afternoon during my forced time away. Then I wrote, let's face it, expectations are a real bitch, a tyrannical part of the human experience that frankly I could do without. And I don't know which is worse, fulfilling them or not fulfilling them. Either way, expectations lead you around by the nose, taunting you to do better, to be better. But expectations, my own, that of others, can't ever be fully satisfied. They're an insatiable master that taunts and mocks, all the while laughing hysterically at you, a deep belly, piss all over yourself kind of laugh. I closed my journal and left my thoughts there at least for now. So there's a page break in there that I'll just tell the audience that we're moving to a different scene. I watched the commencement speaker anticipate the next name. The graduate with the same last name, the same chin, the same hazel green eyes, me. While I waited for my name to be called, forever it seemed, I took in my surroundings for what I suspected would be the last time. After today, I'd be gone. I wasn't one for alumni events, drunken gatherings spent reminiscing about the good old days, sloppy attempts to recast one's life in a more favorable way. Don't get me wrong, as an experience, college and medical school were fine, if not somewhat predictable, but for me it was a means to an end, nothing more, nothing less. I had a close look around. The old brick buildings of Harvard Yard and the chapel stood guard over the ceremony, silhouetted by the setting sun at the end of a perfect late spring day in Cambridge. The whole proceeding had the musty smell of tradition, further accentuated by an equal mix of aristocracy and academic snobbery. The students, my classmates, would soon be actual doctors. We had fought and scratched, competed with each other when that was called for, and cooperated with one another when that was the best route. But now it would only be a matter of minutes before we can put an MD after our names, so we sat quietly, waiting patiently for what was next, the quality most valued in medical students, obedient little soldiers of a fledgling medical brigade. After the ceremony began and the perfunctory comments were made, the current medical school dean read the list of graduates one by one. Each new doctor walked up to the podium, smiled, shook hands with the commencement speaker, and right on cue turned to a photographer who snapped each of their smiling faces, documenting perhaps the last time these accomplished people would be this happy or this hopeful. Now all but two names have been called: the top student in the class and the second-ranked one, or as the class members called the runner-up, the bridesmaid. In our graduating class, I was the bridesmaid, and I should say straight away there was no shame in being second, at least in my mind. After all, I'd finished ahead of exactly 131 other overachievers who would sell their mothers to a Mexican drug cartel to occupy my spot. But now I'm sounding defensive for reasons that will soon become clear. And the honor of the second-ranked graduate goes to Dr. Joseph Bosco. I sat in the first row, just off the aisle seat, and smiled ever so slightly at first, but not with any sense of accomplishment or pride. Rising to the occasion, cognizant of the prying eyes fixed on me, I plastered on an obligatory smile. It was time to do the walk now. I pulled my head up, straightened my back, stood ramrod straight, military style, even though I would be the least likely person in the history of mankind to ever be in the military, and walked to the podium to get my diploma, to have my picture taken with the commencement speaker, dear old dad, Dr. Peter Bosco, the former Harvard Medical School dean and the current Tulane University president, and oh, a Nobel Prize laureate, the scientist who had untangled the mystery of the amyloid tangles in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. As the audience at the graduation ceremony applauded and the class rose to honor my accomplishment as first runner-up, father and son turned to the camera, and as we smiled, beaming in a moment that at least on the surface looked perfect, the original Dr. Bosco said to me, the new Dr. Bosco, "Do you know what second place is, son?" I nodded, the smile still cemented on my face. "Yeah, I do. First loser, just like you always told me." The photographer got the photo he wanted, the one at the right angle and with the right smiles, the photo that would go up on one of the medical school walls documenting the day the Bosco kid left Harvard Yard for good. And I vowed right then, in that moment, to never, ever be a bridesmaid again.
That is a great tease and a great lead to want to read more.
I hope so. The beginnings of books are always difficult. You never know really where to start or where to end. So
And did you start with that and it was it?
that would the beginning of the book stayed the same actually through 3 years since you and I last talked. The ending of the book I think I read 3 or 4 different endings,
Wow.
which was months of work. Um, but the beginning stayed the same. My group agent, editor, publicist. We were all pretty happy with the beginning. It was the ending that we disagreed about.
And so how does that work? Like, were you the one who expressed this isn't feeling quite right? Was it outside reviewers, the people you just mentioned, saying that doesn't work? How
Pretty much all the above. We did see the ending different ways, and I trust the people around me. They have a whole lot more experience than I do in this world, and I do trust the people around me. So I'll listen carefully to them. And we got actually folks that didn't know me and didn't know anything about me to read the book and help us with that. They were sort of beta testers, if you will. And so we did a lot of work on the ending because we weren't we were, the way I ended the book originally, we weren't sure that was the best way to do it.
again, second tease. Now we want to know about the ending. And today is the day it is released.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just went out to the mailbox and got my actual copy of it. So here it
So
is.
exciting. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
good. It is available now.
yeah. It's out there.
So part of that was about self expectations in that
Mm.
intro, living up to the expectations of others. Um, and obviously, I think a lot of people, there's imposter complexes, there's, people feeling unworthy. So mental health is such a key thing, obviously, in that field, but for anyone. So I'd love it if you could talk more about your efforts to achieve work-life balance and share what are your elements of self-care.
Yeah, both my books actually more than touch on, I would say, mental health issues because I think it's such a big part of not only the patients I cared for, who understandably often had, depression and anxiety and all sorts of things because they had such horrible lung disease and heart disease. So we also saw this in the team. Again, getting back to the people that care for these very sick patients, I think what you saw is, empathy, depletion, compassion, fatigue, all the burnout that you've read about with regard to COVID, and there was also dysfunctional behavior, and I wrote about this in my novel. My protagonist, I like certain aspects of him and not others, and he had some dysfunctional behaviors that needed to be straightened out as well. And so I think it's really important to address those issues, especially as it relates to healthcare head on. I'm no expert in this certainly, and there was times in my career where I did not have good work-life balance, and I knew it at the time. And my mantra has been, and now I advise a lot of younger people in the field, is remember the 3 F's. And to me, the F's are family, friends, and faith. And faith to me is not just, a particular religion or even a form of religion at all. It's faith, it's spirituality, it's the things that we do that we take care of ourselves. But I think for either patients or the people that provide the care, I think isolation is the enemy. And I think that if we can stay connected to our family and friends, certainly that's great. If we can also stay connected to a faith practice, I think that's great. Whether it's reading a book, meditating, formal religion, whatever. I think that's really important.
So despite having moved from a team sport to a more isolating practice, it maybe opened up your ability to fully embrace the 3 F's.
I think so. I think it gave me the space to do so. I mean, I think one thing that I was lacking when I was in Palo Alto, especially, is, I had family and friends and everything else around me, but I didn't have the bandwidth for it all the time, unfortunately. And sometimes even when I was physically present, I wasn't psychologically, emotionally present at home. And one of the reasons I decided to step away from the front lines is my 2 daughters were growing up and getting older and entering high school years, and it was no longer acceptable for me just to be, off either physically or emotionally at the hospital.
And you ended up returning to your roots.
Yep. Going back to the bayou. I tell people I didn't move from Palo Alto to New Orleans for the weather. I can tell you that. It's already hot.
Well, so next, just so people, we've already shared, today was the release date, June 11th, but where can people access the book? Where can they learn more about it? Are you on tour? Where should people go?
Yeah, you can go. The simplest is probably go to David Weil, David Weill.com, my website. I actually have a new website since you and I last talked. So it's just instead of David Weil MD, it's just davidweil.com. There's a lot of information there about what I'm up to and what I'm doing next, but also I'm pretty active on social media, and so Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. My folks that are working with me are trying to get me on TikTok, but that one I've been a little resistant to. So, but I'm easy to find on the other ones. Let's put it that way.
Well, I encourage everybody to find you. And again, that website, there's even a trailer, right, for the book.
Yep,
The video
yep,
trailer
yep.
is great. And I think you can read the first chapter
You can,
possibly.
you can
So
download the first chapter, and if you don't like it, you don't have to buy it, and I'll never know.
chances are people will want to buy it. So
I hope so.
it is so good to see you again. And, you're always part of the transplant world, obviously professionally, but for those of us who have known you through the years, through Stanford, you're always part of this community. And we are so happy for you to release this second book and looking forward to book number 3.
Thank you, Sari, and thanks for having me. And the best to all your listenership. They're near and dear to my heart. So.